The water had been standing in the basement for 3 years, black, stagnant, smelling of rot and chemicals that had long since leached from forgotten barrels. The real estate agent wouldn't even go down the stairs. She stood at the top, wrinkling her nose, her heels clicking against the warped floorboards as she gestured vaguely toward the darkness below. $500, she said, as though the price itself was an insult. Take it or leave it. No one else will. Sarah Matthews stood in the doorway of what had once been the Riverside Distillery, her daughter's hand gripped tightly in her own. The building loomed around her, its windows shattered, its walls streaked with water damage and mildew. The roof sagged in places where rain had pressed through rotting shingles, and the smell that rose from every corner was thick enough to taste. She could feel Emma trembling beside her, the 8-year-old's fingers cold despite the summer heat. The agent was still talking, her voice sharp with impatience. No utilities, no plumbing that works, foundations probably shot. The whole thing should have been condemned years ago. But if you want it, the county'll take anything to get it off the books. Sarah said nothing. She stared at the staircase that descended into the flooded cellar, at the black water lapping against the 3rd step from the bottom. She thought of the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, of the $63 left in her checking account, of the job she'd lost 2 months ago when the diner closed without warning. She thought of Emma's school fees, the groceries she couldn't afford, the nights she'd lain awake, calculating pennies, and coming up short every time. $500 was everything she had left. It was the last check from her mother's estate, the final piece of a life that had ended too soon and left too little behind. She could spend it on rent, buy herself another month in the apartment before the landlord finally threw them out, or she could take a chance on something no one else wanted, something broken and flooded and abandoned. The agent tapped her watch. "I've got another showing in 20 minutes. What's it gonna be?" Sarah looked down at Emma, at the wide eyes staring up at her, trusting, terrified. She thought of all the times she'd told her daughter that things would get better, that they just had to keep trying, keep believing. She thought of the promises she'd made and couldn't keep, the hope she'd carried even when it felt like a lie. She turned back to the agent and heard herself say the words before she could stop them. "I'll take it." The agent blinked, surprise flickering across her face before it hardened into something colder. "Your funeral." She pulled a folder from her bag and slapped it onto a dust-covered table. "Sign here." Sarah's hands shook as she wrote her name on the line. The ink looked too dark, too permanent, as though she were signing away more than money. When she handed the pen back, the agent didn't meet her eyes. She took the check, glanced at it, and shoved it into her purse. "Good luck," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe in luck at all. Then she was gone, heels echoing down the hallway, the door slamming behind her with a finality that made Sarah's chest tighten. For a long moment, mother and daughter stood alone in the silence. The building creaked around them, settling into itself like something alive. Emma's voice, small and uncertain, broke the stillness. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Sarah knelt, pulling her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I don't know yet, baby, but we're gonna figure it out." The town had been watching. Of course they had. In a place as small as Riverside, nothing happened without an audience. By the time Sarah drove Emma home that evening, the news had already spread. The single mother who'd lost her job and couldn't pay rent had just bought the old distillery. The building everyone knew was worthless. For $500 she didn't have to spare. At the grocery store the next morning, Sarah felt the stares, and she moved through the aisles with her head down, filling her basket with the cheapest items she could find. Bread on sale, dented cans of soup, bruised apples marked down to pennies. The woman at the register, a neighbor from 2 streets over, rang up her items without a word, but her lips were pressed tight with disapproval. "Heard you bought the old distillery," she said at last, her voice loud enough to carry. "That true?" Sarah nodded, handing over the bills she'd counted 3 times before leaving the house. The woman shook her head slowly, pity and contempt mingling in her expression. "You know that place has been flooded for years, right? Foundations cracked, whole buildings sinking into the ground." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "My husband says it'd cost more to fix than it'd ever be worth, and says anyone who buys it is throwing money into a hole." Sarah took her change without answering and walked out, Emma trailing behind her. But the words followed her home, settling into her thoughts like stones. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned into open commentary. At the post office, a man she barely knew asked if she planned to live in the distillery now that she'd lost her apartment. At the gas station, the attendant laughed and said he'd heard she was going to turn it into a palace. The mockery was everywhere, woven into glances and half-hidden smiles, into questions that weren't really questions, but judgments dressed up as curiosity. One evening, as Sarah sat on the crumbling front steps of her apartment building, her landlord approached. He was a thin man with a face like a blade, sharp and unyielding. She knew what he was going to say before he opened his mouth. "You got 2 weeks," he said. "Then you're out." "I've been more than patient." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He glanced toward the distillery, visible in the distance, its silhouette dark against the evening sky. "Heard you bought that wreck," he snorted. "Hope you're planning to live there, 'cause you sure as hell aren't staying here." When he left, Sarah sat in the gathering dusk and felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had gambled everything on a building that no one believed in, a structure so damaged it might not even be salvageable. And yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. There was something about the distillery, something in the way it stood defiant against the years of neglect, that spoke to her. It was broken, yes, but it was hers. The distillery became her project, her obsession, her last hope. Every morning after dropping Emma at school, she returned to the building with whatever tools she could borrow or buy secondhand. She started with the upper floors, clearing away debris, boarding up windows, sweeping out years of dust and leaves. The work was brutal. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and more than once she broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had taken on. But she kept going. She pried up rotting floorboards and hauled them outside. She scrubbed walls until her arms trembled. She climbed onto the roof with a borrowed tarp and covered the worst of the holes, knowing it was only temporary, but needing to do something, anything, to keep the rain out. The townspeople drove by slowly, craning their necks to watch her work. Some honked and waved, their smiles mocking. Others simply stared, shaking their heads as though witnessing a tragedy in slow motion. No one stopped to help. At night, exhausted and aching, Sarah would sit with Emma in their apartment and read her stories, her voice steady even as her thoughts churned. She didn't tell her daughter about the comments she'd heard, about the bets some men at the bar had made on how long it would take before she gave up. She didn't mention the bank letter warning that her account was overdrawn, or the fact that they were eating cereal for dinner because she couldn't afford anything else. Instead, she told Emma about the distillery's history. She'd found old photographs at the library, images of the building in its prime, when it had been a place of industry and pride. She showed her daughter pictures of workers standing beside massive copper stills, of barrels stacked high in cellars, of bottles lined up like soldiers ready for battle. "This used to be something important," she said, "and maybe it can be again." Emma, ever hopeful, believed her, but Sarah wasn't sure she believed herself. The cellar remained untouched. Every time Sarah descended the stairs and saw the black water waiting below, her resolve faltered. She told herself she would deal with it later, after the roof was fixed, after the windows were secure, after she had money for a pump. But the truth was simpler and darker. She was afraid. The water looked too deep, too still. It smelled of decay and chemicals, of things best left undisturbed. More than once she had stood at the edge, lantern in hand, and imagined what might be down there. Broken equipment, she told herself. Rusted barrels. Nothing of value. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the cellar was waiting for her, holding its breath, daring her to step into its depths. 2 weeks passed. The landlord kept his word. Sarah packed what little they owned into boxes and loaded them into her car. Emma cried as they left the apartment, clutching a stuffed bear that had been with her since she was a baby. Sarah held her close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. They moved into the distillery that night. Sarah had cleared one room on the second floor, scrubbed it as clean as she could manage, and set up 2 sleeping bags on the floor. There was no electricity, no running water, no heat. But it was theirs. Emma fell asleep quickly, exhausted from crying. Sarah lay awake, for listening to the building settle around her. Every creak sounded like a warning, every gust of wind like a whisper telling her she had made a terrible mistake. She thought of the $500, gone now, vanished into a structure that might collapse before she could ever make it whole. She thought of her mother, who had worked her entire life and left behind so little. She thought of Emma, sleeping beside her, trusting her to make things right. And she thought of the cellar. It was always there, lurking at the edges of her mind. The black water, the smell of rot, the sense that something was hidden below, something that had been waiting for years to be found. She told herself it was foolishness. The desperation was making her imagine things that weren't there. But the thought wouldn't leave her. The next morning, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the boards she'd nailed over the windows. Emma was still asleep, curled around her bear. Sarah dressed quietly and descended the stairs, her boots echoing in the empty building. She walked through the main floor, past the remnants of old equipment, past the places where barrels had once stood, until she reached the staircase that led down. The smell was stronger here, sharp and acrid. She stood at the top, staring into the gloom, and felt her heart pounding. She had put this off long enough. If she was going to make the distillery livable, she had to face the cellar. She had to see what the water had claimed, and what, if anything, could be salvaged. Sarah descended slowly, 1 step at a time. The wood creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step, that by the time she reached the 3rd step from the bottom, the one where the water lapped gently, she could barely breathe. The surface was still, reflecting the faint light from above like a mirror. She crouched, holding the lantern over the water, and peered into its depths. At first she saw nothing but darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she noticed shapes beneath the surface. Barrels, their tops just visible. Metal equipment, twisted and corroded. And something else. Something that didn't belong. A glint. Faint, but unmistakable. Sarah's breath caught. She leaned closer, her hand gripping the railing to steady herself. The glint came again, deeper in the water, like a reflection catching light that shouldn't be there. Her pulse quickened. She straightened, her mind racing. It could be anything, she told herself. A piece of metal, a broken bottle, nothing of value. But the thought that it might be something more, something hidden and forgotten, refused to let go. She climbed back up the stairs, her legs trembling. Emma was awake now, sitting in her sleeping bag and rubbing her eyes. "Morning, Mama." Sarah forced a smile. "Morning, baby." But her thoughts were already elsewhere, already circling back to the cellar and the water and the faint glint she had seen. She told herself she would need equipment, a pump, waders, something to drain the water, or at least push it back enough to see what lay beneath. She didn't have money for any of it, but she would find a way. Over the next few days, Sarah became a woman possessed. She borrowed a pump from a man at the hardware store who pitied her enough to lend it without asking for a deposit. She bought waders at a thrift store. Their rubber cracked, but still serviceable. She hauled extension cords from the upper floors and rigged a system that would let her run the pump off a neighbor's generator, promising to pay him back when she could. The townspeople watched her preparations with amusement. At the diner, where she sometimes stopped for coffee she couldn't afford, men laughed openly about the crazy woman trying to drain a cellar that had been flooded for years. One of them, a contractor who'd turned down the distillery when the county first tried to sell it, leaned over and said, "You know that water's probably 6 feet deep, right? And even if you drain it, there's nothing down there but rot." Sarah didn't answer. She paid for her coffee and left. On a gray morning, with clouds pressing low and the threat of rain heavy in the air, and Sarah descended into the cellar once more. This time, she wore the waders, the pump slung over her shoulder, the extension cord trailing behind her like a lifeline. Emma had begged to come with her, but Sarah had insisted she stay upstairs, safe and dry. The water was cold even through the rubber. Sarah waded in slowly, feeling the bottom shift beneath her feet. Mud and debris clung to her boots, pulling at her with every step. The pump roared to life when she flipped the switch, its motor loud and angry, and water began to pour out through the hose she'd dragged to the surface. It was slow work. The pump labored, coughing and sputtering, and for a long time, it seemed like the water level wasn't dropping at all. But Sarah was patient. She stood in the cold, her hands gripping the pump, and watched as inch by inch the black surface began to recede. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, its light filtering weakly through the gaps in the floorboards above. Sarah's legs acted from standing, and her arms trembled from holding the pump steady. But she didn't stop. By late afternoon, the water had dropped nearly 2 feet. Shapes that had been hidden began to emerge. Old barrels, their staves swollen and split. Shelves collapsed into heaps of wood and rust. Equipment she couldn't identify, twisted and corroded beyond recognition. And then, as the light shifted and the water dropped further, she saw it. A door. It was set into the far wall, half submerged, its wood dark and swollen. Sarah's heart stuttered. She waded closer, the water now only waist-high, and reached out to touch the surface. The wood was solid despite its age, and when she pressed her hand against it, she felt something give, a faint movement as though the door had been waiting for her touch. Her hand shook as she searched for a handle. There was none, only a heavy iron latch, rusted but still intact. She pulled at it, her fingers slipping on the wet metal, and after several tries it gave way with a groan. The door swung inward, water rushing past her into the space beyond. Sarah lifted the lantern and stepped through. The room beyond was smaller than the main cellar, its ceiling low and its walls lined with shelves. The water here was shallower, barely reaching her knees, and as she moved forward, the lantern's light swept across the space, revealing what had been hidden for years. Rows of bottles, hundreds of them, stacked carefully on the shelves, their glass dark and dusty but unbroken. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, and lifted one from its place. The label was faded, the ink blurred by moisture, but she could still make out the words, Riverside Distillery, 1947. Her hands trembled as she set the bottle down and reached for another. This one was older, the label barely legible, 1939. Another, 1931. The dates stretched back, each bottle a piece of history sealed in glass and forgotten. But it wasn't just the age that made her pulse race. It was what lay beyond the bottles. At the far end of the room, Partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf was a trunk. It was large, bound with iron straps, its wood dark and swollen but still intact. Sarah waded toward it, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it over the hum of the pump. She knelt in the shallow water and forced the latch open. The lid resisted, then gave way with a groan. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, were bundles. She lifted one carefully, peeling back the fabric, and froze. Paper. Crisp, yellowed, but unmistakable. Currency. Old bills, their denominations large, their designs unfamiliar. She lifted another bundle, then another, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The trunk was filled with them, stacked neatly, preserved in the oilcloth as though someone had known they would be here for a very long time. Sarah sat back, the water soaking through her clothes, and stared at the bundles in her lap. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The numbers on the bills swam before her eyes, and she realized with a jolt that these weren't just old. They were rare, valuable. She thought of the contractor who'd said there was nothing down here but rot. She thought of the agent who'd barely been able to hide her contempt. She thought of the townsfolk who'd laughed and made bets on how long she'd last. None of them had known. None of them had believed. Sarah lifted her eyes to the shelves, to the rows of bottles that stretched into shadow, and then back to the trunk. Her mind raced, trying to calculate, to understand. How much was here? How much had been hidden in this forgotten room, sealed away by someone who'd never returned to claim it? She didn't know, but she knew it was more than she'd ever imagined, more than she'd dared to hope. Above her, she heard Emma's voice calling, small and worried. "Mama, are you okay?" Sarah's chest tightened. She looked down at the bundles in her hands, and at the water still lapping around her knees, at the door she had opened, and the secret it had revealed. Her life had been defined by loss, by struggle, by the weight of choices that had never seemed to lead anywhere but down. But here, in the cold and the dark, surrounded by what no one else had believed existed, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but possibility, a chance. A door opened when every other door had been slammed in her face. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and called back up the stairs. "I'm okay, baby. I'm coming." But before she climbed out of the water, she took one more look at the room, at the bottles, at the trunk, at the secret that had waited in darkness for someone desperate enough, stubborn enough, to find it. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the Sarah Matthews allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The pump continued to hum, draining the water inch by inch, revealing more of the cellar's secrets with every passing hour. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, watching the black surface recede, her mind still reeling from what she had found. She wanted to go back down, to open every bottle, to count every bill, to understand the full scope of what lay hidden in that room. But she forced herself to wait. Emma was watching her with wide eyes, sensing something had changed, but too young to understand what. Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the warmth of her small body, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring out at the dark shape of the distillery rising against the sky, on her thoughts churning. The trunk, the bottles, the bills wrapped in oilcloth, every image burned in her mind like a brand. She thought of the person who had hidden them, the care they had taken, the deliberate secrecy. Why had they never returned? What had kept them from claiming what was theirs? The questions circled endlessly, but she had no answers. Only the certainty that her life had just been irrevocably altered by a choice made in desperation, and a discovery born of stubborn refusal to give up. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Sarah was already awake. She dressed Emma, fed her a simple breakfast, and drove her to school. The other mothers glanced at her with the same mixture of pity and disdain they always had, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, already back in the cellar, already planning her next steps. She returned to the distillery and descended once more. The water had dropped another foot overnight, revealing more of the room's contents. She waded through the shallow remnants, her lantern casting long shadows across the shelves. The bottles gleamed faintly in the light, rows upon rows of them, each one a piece of history sealed in glass. She began to catalog them, lifting each bottle carefully, noting the dates and labels. Some were from the 1940s, others from the 1930s, and a few even older. Their labels so faded she could barely read them. She set aside the ones that looked most valuable, the ones whose glass was still clear and whose seals were intact. But it was the trunk that drew her back again and again. She opened it once more, her hands trembling, and began to count the bundles. There were more than she had realized. Dozens of them, each wrapped tightly in oilcloth. She peeled back the fabric on several, her breath catching as she saw the denominations. $100 bills. 500. Even a few $1,000 notes, their designs ornate and unfamiliar. She didn't know much about currency, but she knew these were old enough to be worth far more than their face value. The thought made her dizzy. As she worked, she noticed something else. Beneath the bundles, at the bottom of the trunk, was a leather folder. She lifted it carefully, the material stiff and cracked with age. Inside were documents, yellowed and brittle, their ink faded, but still legible. Sarah spread them out on a dry shelf and began to read. They were letters, receipts, records of transactions. The handwriting was neat, the words formal, and as she read, a picture began to form. The distillery had been more than just a business. It had been a front, a place where deals were made in secret, where money changed hands far from the eyes of the law. The documents spoke of shipments, of payments made under the table, of men whose names she didn't recognize, but whose influence was clear. One letter, dated 1933, mentioned the repeal of prohibition and the need to secure assets before the government came calling. Another, from a year later, spoke of a plan to hide the profits, to seal them away until the heat died down. The writer's tone was urgent, almost desperate, as though they knew time was running out. Sarah's hands shook as she read. The trunk, the bottles, the hidden room. It all made sense now. Someone had used the distillery to hide wealth during a time of upheaval, had sealed it away in the cellar, and had never returned to claim it. Whether they had been caught or killed, or simply vanished, she would never know. But their loss was her gain. She sat back, the documents spread before her, and felt the weight of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just money. It was a legacy, a story written in secrets and sealed in darkness. And now it belonged to her. The days that followed were a blur of discovery and disbelief. Sarah drained the cellar completely, revealing the full extent of the hidden room. She cataloged every bottle, every bundle, every scrap of paper. She worked late into the night, her hands raw and her back ached. But she couldn't stop. The more she uncovered, the more she realized the scale of what had been left behind. She kept her discovery quiet. She told no one, not even Emma, the full extent of what she had found. But she knew that if word got out, the town would descend on her like vultures. They would question her right to it, would try to claim a piece, would turn her fortune into a spectacle. She couldn't let that happen. Instead, she continued to work on the distillery, repairing what she could, making the building livable. She moved carefully, deliberately, giving no outward sign that anything had changed. To the town, she was still the desperate woman who'd bought a ruin for pennies, and she intended to keep it that way. But inside, everything had shifted. The fear that had driven her, the desperation that had pushed her to take the risk, had been replaced by something else. Not certainty. Not yet. But a growing sense that she had been given a chance most people never got. A chance to rewrite her story, to build something from nothing, and to prove that belief in the impossible could sometimes be rewarded. Late one night, as she sat in the small room on the second floor with Emma asleep beside her, Sarah pulled out one of the bundles and held it up to the lantern light. The bills were crisp despite their age, their edges sharp. She imagined the hands that had counted them, the person who had wrapped them so carefully, who had hidden them with the belief that one day they would return. They never had, but she had found them. And in finding them, she had found something else, a way forward, a path out of the darkness that had threatened to swallow her whole. She set the bundle down and looked at her daughter, at the peaceful rise and fall of her chest. For Emma, she would do whatever it took. She would protect this secret, guard it fiercely, until the time was right to reveal it. And when that time came, she would make sure that no one, not the town, not the county, not anyone, could take it away. The distillery stood silent around her, its walls holding the weight of history and hope. And in the cellar below, the hidden room waited, its secrets now hers to keep. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself believe, fully and completely, that the worst was behind her, that the struggle, the mockery, the fear, had all been leading to this moment, to this discovery, to this chance. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning after Sarah fully drained the cellar, she woke to find frost on the windows. Winter was coming early, and the distillery had no heat. Emma shivered in her sleeping bag, and her breath visible in the cold air. Sarah wrapped a blanket around her daughter's shoulders and lit the camping stove she'd bought at a yard sale, boiling water for oatmeal that would have to stretch for 2 meals. As they ate in silence, Sarah's mind was already in the cellar. The bottles, the trunk, the documents that told a story of secrets and desperation not unlike her own. She had spent half the night reading through the papers, piecing together the history of the distillery's final days before Prohibition ended and the world changed. The owner, a man named Victor Ashford, had been more than a distiller. He'd been a smuggler, a dealer in the shadows, a man who'd made a fortune when alcohol was forbidden and lost everything when it became legal again. The letters spoke of debts, of men coming for what they were owed, and of a plan to hide the profits until the danger passed. But Victor Ashford had never returned. The last document was dated April 1934, a hastily written note that mentioned the need to leave town immediately. After that, nothing. The distillery had been abandoned, left to rot, its secrets sealed in the flooded cellar for nearly 90 years. Sarah had Googled his name on her phone, using the last of her data plan. She'd found a brief obituary from 1935. Victor Ashford, dead at 42, cause unlisted. No mention of family, no heirs, nothing. The man had vanished from history as completely as his fortune had vanished into the earth. Until now. After dropping Emma at school, Sarah returned to the cellar. The pump sat silent now, its work done. The floor was still damp, the walls streaked with water stains, but the room was fully revealed. She stood at the threshold of the hidden chamber, lantern in hand, and felt the weight of what she was about to do. She began systematically removing the bottles, carrying them up the stairs one by one. Her back screamed in protest, her arms trembled, but she didn't stop. Each bottle was placed carefully on a makeshift table she'd constructed from old planks. By midday, she had moved more than 200 bottles, their glass catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the boarded windows. She studied the labels, noting the dates, the varieties, the distillery's stamp pressed into the wax seals. Some bottles were bourbon, others rye whiskey, and a few were labeled as experimental batches, one-of-a-kind creations that had never made it to market. The oldest was dated 1929, its glass thick and dark, its seal still intact. And Sarah knew nothing about rare spirits, but she knew enough to understand that age and rarity meant value. These weren't just old bottles. They were artifacts, pieces of a lost era when the distillery had been at its peak, and they had been preserved perfectly, sealed away in conditions that had somehow, against all odds, kept them from spoiling. The trunk came next. She hauled it up the stairs, grunting with effort, and set it in the corner of the room. She opened it again, spreading the oilcloth bundles across the floor. The bills stared back at her, crisp and surreal. She counted them slowly, making notes in a small notebook she'd found in Emma's school supplies. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. There were over 400 bundles, each containing bills of varying denominations. She didn't know their collector value, but even at face value, the sum was staggering. Far more than she'd ever imagined. But it was the documents that troubled her, the letters, the receipts, the records of transactions that spoke of illegal dealings and hidden wealth. She didn't know if what she'd found was legally hers. The distillery belonged to her, yes. But the contents, the money and bottles hidden by a man who died nearly a century ago. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She thought of going to a lawyer, but lawyers cost money she didn't have. She thought of contacting the county, but the memory of the agent's contempt, the way the town had laughed at her, made her hesitate. What if they tried to take it? What if they claimed the county had rights to anything found on the property? She couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until she knew exactly what she had and what it was worth. That evening, after picking up Emma from school, Sarah drove to the library. It was a small building on the edge of town, its shelves dusty and half empty. But it had computers with free internet access. She settled Emma in the children's section with a stack of picture books and sat down at one of the terminals. She started with the bottles. She searched for rare whiskey, pre-prohibition spirits, collectible bourbon. The results overwhelmed her. Articles about auctions where single bottles had sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Forums where collectors discussed the value of vintages from distilleries that no longer existed. Photographs of bottles similar to hers, their prices listed in amounts that made her dizzy. One article caught her attention. A bottle of whiskey from 1926, sold at auction for $78,000. Another, from a distillery that had closed during Prohibition, had fetched over $100,000. The key factors were age, rarity, provenance, and condition. Sarah's bottles had all of that. She moved on to the currency. Old bills, rare denominations, collectible notes. The research was harder here, the information scattered and technical. But she learned enough to understand that certain bills from the 1920s and 1930s, especially high-denomination notes that had been taken out of circulation, were worth far more than their face value. A $500 bill from 1928 could be worth $15,000. A $1,000 note, even more. And there were rumors, whispered among collectors, of notes so rare that their value was almost incalculable. Sarah's pulse raced as she read. She thought of the bundles in the trunk, of the bills she'd seen, of the denominations that had seemed impossible. If even a fraction of what she'd found was as valuable as the articles suggested, then she wasn't just looking at a way out of poverty. She was looking at generational wealth. The thought terrified her. She closed the browser and sat back, her mind spinning. Emma was still reading, oblivious to the storm of thoughts raging in her mother's head. Sarah watched her daughter, so small and trusting, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a shroud. This wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever she did next would determine Emma's future, her education, her opportunities, her life. Sarah couldn't afford to make a mistake. She couldn't let desperation or hope cloud her judgment. She needed help. But who could she trust? The answer came to her slowly. There was a man, an antiques dealer who ran a shop 2 towns over. She'd met him once, years ago, when she'd tried to sell her mother's jewelry after the funeral. He'd been kind, honest, offering her far more than she'd expected. He'd even tried to talk her out of selling, suggesting she keep the pieces for Emma. His name was Martin Cross, and if anyone could help her understand the value of what she'd found without betraying her confidence, it was him. The next morning, Sarah left Emma with a neighbor and drove to Martin's shop. The building was small, tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat, its windows filled with glassware and old furniture. A bell chimed as she pushed open the door. Martin looked up from behind the counter, his face creasing into a smile of recognition. Sarah. It's been a while. He was in his 60s, his hair silver, his eyes sharp but kind. What brings you in? Sarah hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a single bottle. She'd chosen carefully, selecting one of the older bottles, dated 1931, with the Riverside Distillery label still clear. She set it on the counter between them. Martin's expression shifted immediately. His smile faded, replaced by intense focus. He lifted the bottle carefully, turning it in the light, studying the label, the seal, the glass itself. Where did you get this? I found it, Sarah said, in the distillery I bought. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. The old Riverside place? The one that's been flooded for years? She nodded. Martin set the bottle down and leaned back, folding his arms. You're telling me this was sealed in that cellar all this time? Yes. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the bottle and Sarah's face. Then he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a magnifying glass. He examined the seal, the label, the glass, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah's heart pounded as she waited. Finally, Martin set the glass down and met her eyes. This is real. Pre-prohibition. Sealed and preserved. He paused, as though weighing his words. Do you have any idea what this is worth? Sarah's mouth was dry. No. That's why I'm here. Martin picked up the bottle again, cradling it like something sacred. A bottle like this, in this condition, from a distillery that's been closed for 90 years? He shook his head slowly. At auction, you're looking at anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. Maybe more, depending on the buyer. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of the counter, her knees threatening to buckle. That's one bottle? Martin nodded. And if you have more, if they're all in this condition, then you're sitting on a fortune. Sarah couldn't speak. She stared at the bottle, at the faded label, at the liquid inside that had waited nearly a century to be found. $100,000 for one bottle, and she had hundreds. Martin's voice broke through her shock. How many are we talking about? She swallowed hard. A lot. Maybe 200. Maybe more. He let out a low whistle. Sarah, if what you're telling me is true, you need to be very, very careful. Bottles like this attract attention. The wrong kind of attention. There are people who do anything to get their hands on a collection like that. She nodded, and fear threading through the disbelief. You need to document everything, Martin continued. Photographs, labels, seals. You need provenance, proof that these came from the distillery, that they're legitimate. And you need to decide how you're going to sell them. Private sale, auction, dealer. Each has risks. Sarah listened, her mind racing. What would you do? Martin was quiet for a moment. I'd start by having them authenticated. There are experts, people who specialize in rare spirits. They can verify the age, the condition, the value. Once you have that, you can make an informed decision. He paused. But Sarah, this is going to change your life, and not everyone's going to be happy about it. She understood what he wasn't saying. The town that had mocked her, that had watched her struggle and laughed at her desperation, would not take kindly to her sudden fortune. There would be questions, accusations, envy. She would become a target. Martin seemed to read her thoughts. Keep this quiet as long as you can. Don't tell anyone what you found, not until you're ready. He reached under the counter again and pulled out a business card. This is a colleague of mine. He deals in rare whiskey, works with collectors all over the world. He's trustworthy. If you want him to take a look, I can make an introduction. Sarah took the card, her fingers trembling. Thank you. Martin's expression softened. You deserve this, you know. After everything you've been through. Just be smart about it. She left the shop with the bottle carefully wrapped in newspaper, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. $100,000 for one bottle. She did the math as she drove, multiplying, estimating, trying to grasp the enormity of what she'd found. Even if the other bottles were worth half as much, even a quarter, she was looking at millions. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that she almost laughed. She, Sarah Matthews, a single mother who'd been evicted, who'd counted pennies for groceries, who'd spent her last $500 on a ruin, was sitting on a fortune that most people couldn't earn in a lifetime. But the fear was there too, coiling in her chest. Martin's warning echoed in her mind. The wrong kind of attention. People who'd do anything. She thought of the townspeople, of the way they'd looked at her with contempt. What would they do if they knew? She couldn't let them find out. Not yet. Over the following days, Sarah worked in secret. She photographed every bottle, every label, every seal. She documented the trunk, the bundles, the papers. She created spreadsheets on her phone, listing dates and denominations and conditions. The work was meticulous, exhausting, but it gave her a sense of control. Emma asked questions, curious about the bottles, about the late nights, about the way her mother's mood had shifted. Sarah deflected, telling her she was cataloging old stock, that it was boring work, nothing to worry about. Emma, trusting as always, accepted the explanation, but the town was beginning to notice. Sarah's truck was parked at the distillery more often, her trips in and out more frequent. She'd seen people slowing down, staring, trying to peer through the boarded windows. One afternoon, a man she didn't recognize knocked on the door, claiming to be interested in buying the property. Sarah told him it wasn't for sale and closed the door in his face. The next day, someone spray-painted "sold out" across the side of the building. She scrubbed it off, her jaw tight, anger simmering beneath her skin. They thought she'd given up. They thought she was admitting defeat. They had no idea. Martin called a week later. His colleague, a man named Richard Denning, was willing to drive up from the city to examine the collection. He specialized in pre-prohibition spirits and had connections to collectors and auction houses around the world. Sarah agreed, her stomach twisting with nervous anticipation. Richard arrived on a cold, gray morning. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, dressed in a wool coat and polished shoes that seemed out of place in the rundown distillery. He shook her hand, his grip firm, and his expression unreadable. "Show me," he said. Sarah led him to the second floor, where she'd arranged the bottles on makeshift shelves. Richard's eyes widened as he took in the collection. He moved slowly, reverently, lifting bottles one by one, examining them with a jeweler's loupe, making notes in a leather-bound journal. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Sarah stood by the window, watching him work, her heart pounding. Finally, Richard set down the last bottle and turned to face her. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "I've spent 20 years in this business, and I've never seen a collection like this. The condition, the variety, the provenance. It's museum quality." Sarah's breath caught. "What's it worth?" Richard was silent for a moment, as though calculating. Conservatively, 20 million. But at auction, with the right buyers, you could be looking at double that. Maybe more. The number hit her like a physical blow. 20 million. 40 million. The words didn't seem real. She heard herself ask, "Are you sure?" Richard nodded. "I'll need to authenticate a few samples, send them to a lab, verify the age and condition. But based on what I'm seeing, yes, I'm sure." Sarah sank onto a crate, her legs unable to hold her. $40 million. It was impossible, absurd. And yet here was a man, calm and professional, telling her it was real. Richard's voice softened. "This is going to change everything for you. I hope you're ready." But Sarah wasn't sure she was. As Richard left, promising to return with authentication results in a few weeks, she stood alone in the room surrounded by bottles that had once been worthless and were now priceless. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her, heavier than any burden she'd carried before. Because she knew what came next. The revelation, the questions, the envy and suspicion and accusations. The town that had mocked her would turn on her with fury, claiming she didn't deserve it, that she'd stolen it, that it belonged to someone else. And maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't deserve it. Maybe fortune had simply smiled on her by accident, a cosmic mistake that could be corrected at any moment. But as she looked at Emma's sleeping bag in the corner, at the threadbare blankets and the camping stove and the evidence of their struggle, she felt something harden inside her. She had bought this building with the last of her money. She had worked until her hands bled and her back gave out. She had endured mockery and contempt and the constant grinding fear of failure. If anyone deserved this, it was her. The authentication took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of waiting, of checking her phone obsessively, of lying awake at night, imagining all the ways this could fall apart. Richard had taken samples of the whiskey, photographs of the bottles, and copies of the documents. He'd promised to be discreet, to keep her identity anonymous until the results came back. Sarah tried to continue as normal, but normalcy felt like a mask she could barely hold in place. She repaired broken floorboards, scrubbed walls, boarded up the last of the shattered windows. She smiled at Emma and read her bedtime stories and pretended that her heart wasn't racing every moment of every day. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, Richard called. His voice was calm, controlled, but she could hear the excitement beneath it. "It's confirmed. Every sample we tested is authentic. Pre-prohibition, aged in the barrel, sealed at the distillery. The condition is extraordinary. Sarah, you're looking at one of the most significant discoveries in the history of American spirits." She closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. "What about the currency?" Richard paused. "I had a colleague examine the bills you photographed. They're genuine. High-denomination notes, most of them withdrawn from circulation in 1969. They're worth far more than face value to collectors. Conservatively, another 12 million. Sarah couldn't breathe. 12 million, added to the bottles. That was $52 million. More than 50 million. The number was so large it felt meaningless, like a word in a foreign language she couldn't translate. Richard's voice brought her back. "We need to talk about next steps, how you want to proceed. Auction, private sale, museum donation. Each option has implications, tax considerations, publicity." He paused. "Sarah, you're going to need lawyers, accountants, people who can help you navigate this." She understood what he wasn't saying. This was beyond her. beyond anything she'd ever imagined or prepared for. She was a single mother who'd worked as a waitress, who'd struggled to keep food on the table. She didn't know how to handle $50 million. But she would learn. She had to. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Sarah sat on the floor of the distillery, surrounded by bottles and bundles and documents. She thought of Victor Ashford, the man who'd hidden this fortune and never returned. She thought of the choices he'd made, the desperation that had driven him, the hope that had kept him going until it was too late. She wondered if he'd ever imagined someone like her finding his secret. A woman with nothing, gambling everything on a ruin no one else wanted. Would he have approved? Would he have felt vindicated, knowing that his carefully hidden wealth had finally been claimed by someone who needed it as much as he once had? She would never know. But sitting there in the cold, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Sarah felt a strange kinship with the man who died 90 years ago. They were both desperate, both stubborn, both willing to risk everything on the belief that something better was waiting. The difference was that she had lived long enough to see it come true. Over the next few days, Sarah began to make plans. She contacted a lawyer in the city, someone Martin had recommended, and explained the situation. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Vance, listened carefully and promised to research the legal implications. Property law, inheritance law, tax law. There were complications, questions that needed answers. But Patricia's initial assessment was hopeful. The distillery belonged to Sarah. The county had sold it to her legally, transferring all rights and ownership. Anything found on the property, as long as it wasn't stolen or claimed by a living heir, was likely hers to keep. The key was proving that Victor Ashford had no surviving heirs. Patricia set to work searching records, obituaries, genealogies. Sarah waited, on her nerves fraying with each passing day. Meanwhile, the town's curiosity was growing. People had noticed Richard's visit, the expensive car parked outside the distillery, the way Sarah seemed less haggard, more focused. Rumors began to spread. Some said she'd found antiques in the building. Others claimed she was planning to reopen the distillery and needed investors. One woman at the grocery store stopped Sarah in the aisle, her voice loud and accusing. "I heard you found something valuable in that old building. That true?" Sarah forced a smile. "Just some old bottles. Nothing special." The woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but she said nothing more. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. She couldn't keep it hidden forever. The authentication, the legal work, the eventual sale, all of it would draw attention, would bring the discovery into the light. She just needed to control the timing, to be ready when the world found out. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with news. "I've traced Victor Ashford's family line. He had a brother who died in World War II, no children. His parents passed before him. There are no living relatives, no one with a legal claim to his estate." Sarah's heart leapt. "So it's mine?" Patricia's voice was measured. "Legally, yes. The property is yours, and by extension, so is anything found on it. But Sarah, once this goes public, there will be challenges. People will come out of the woodwork claiming connections, trying to stake a claim. You need to be prepared for that." "I will be." Patricia paused. "There's something else. I've been in contact with an auction house in New York. They specialize in rare spirits and collectibles. They're very interested in representing you. If you decide to sell, they can handle everything. Security, authentication, marketing. They're predicting the collection could sell for over $60 million. $60 million. Sarah sat down, her legs giving out. The number kept growing, expanding beyond anything she could comprehend. "Think about it," Patricia said. "But don't take too long. Word is starting to spread in collector circles." The discovery of a pre-prohibition cache of this size is unprecedented. Won't stay secret much longer. That night, Sarah stood in the cellar, where it had all begun. The room was dry now, the walls still stained but no longer threatening. The hidden chamber stood open, empty of its treasures. She thought of the moment she'd waded through the black water, of the fear and desperation that had driven her, of the discovery that had changed everything. She'd been given a gift, not because she deserved it, but because she'd been stubborn enough to refuse defeat, because she'd bet everything on a building no one else believed in. And now, the moment of revelation was approaching. The moment when the town that had laughed at her, that had pitied and scorned her, would learn the truth. Sarah smiled in the darkness. Let them laugh now. Let them see what their mockery had blinded them to. She climbed the stairs and locked the cellar door behind her. Tomorrow, she would call the auction house. She would begin the process of selling, of turning glass and paper into security and freedom. But tonight, she would sit with Emma and read her stories and hold her close, knowing that their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The secret was almost ready to be told. And when it was, Sarah Matthews would no longer be the desperate woman who'd bought a ruin. She would be the woman who'd found $50 million in the darkness and claimed every penny of it. The call from the auction house came on a Monday morning in early November. Sarah had been expecting it, but when her phone rang and she saw the New York number, her hand still trembled as she answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Catherine Harlow, the senior specialist at Whitmore and Associates, one of the most prestigious auction houses in the world. Her tone was professional, but warm, the kind of voice that had guided nervous clients through million-dollar transactions countless times before. Suckle, Matthews, we've completed our full authentication and appraisal. I wanted to discuss the results with you personally. Sarah stepped outside, away from where Emma was doing homework at the makeshift table. The November wind cut through her jacket, but she barely felt it. Go ahead. Catherine's voice carried a note of excitement she couldn't quite suppress. The collection is extraordinary. We've authenticated 217 bottles, ranging from 1929 to 1947. Every single one is genuine, properly sealed, and in remarkable condition. The currency has also been verified. 432 bills, including denominations that are extremely rare. Sarah closed her eyes, steadying herself against the doorframe. Based on current market conditions and collector interest, Catherine continued. We're prepared to estimate the entire collection at auction between $58 and $72 million. The number hung in the air between them. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. 72 million. That's our high estimate, yes. The market for pre-prohibition spirits has never been stronger, and the provenance of your collection, the fact that it's been sealed and preserved for 90 years, makes it essentially unprecedented. We've already had inquiries from collectors in 7 countries. Sarah's mind reeled. She'd known the collection was valuable, but hearing it stated so plainly, so officially, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Catherine's tone shifted, becoming more serious. Ms. Matthews, I need to be frank with you. Once we announce this auction, it's going to attract significant media attention. It's national, possibly international. Your story, the discovery, all of it will become public. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought of the town, of the people who'd laughed at her, of the years she'd spent invisible and struggling. No, she thought. But she said, yes. Good. Catherine's voice warmed again. Then let's talk about next steps. We'll need to transport the collection to our facility in New York for cataloging and display. We'll handle all security, insurance, and logistics. The auction itself would take place in March, giving us time to market properly and build anticipation. They talked for another hour, discussing details, contracts, percentages. Sarah's head spun with terms she didn't fully understand, but Patricia, her lawyer, had prepared her well. She asked the right questions, pushed back on points that needed clarifying, and by the time the call ended, she felt both exhilarated and terrified. The secret was about to become public, and there was no turning back. The auction house released the announcement 2 weeks later. Sarah had tried to prepare herself, but nothing could have readied her for the storm that followed. The headline in the New York Times read, "Unprecedented Discovery. $70 million pre-prohibition collection found in flooded distillery." The article detailed the find, interviewed Catherine Harlow, and buried near the end, mentioned Sarah Matthews, a single mother who had purchased the abandoned building for $500. By noon, her phone was ringing constantly. News stations, reporters, documentary producers, all of them wanting interviews, wanting the story, wanting access. Sarah turned off her phone and sat in the distillery, watching through the gaps in the boards as news vans began to arrive. The town exploded. By evening, the streets around the distillery were clogged with vehicles. Reporters set up cameras on the sidewalk. Neighbors who'd never spoken to Sarah were being interviewed, their voices carrying through the cold air. "I always knew there was something special about that place," one woman said, the same woman who'd told Sarah she was throwing money into a hole. "She's a smart one, that Sarah," said the man from the hardware store who'd smirked when she bought the pump. Always had a good head on her shoulders. Sarah watched from the second-floor window, her jaw tight, anger and vindication warring in her chest. They were rewriting history, erasing their mockery, claiming they'd supported her all along. Emma pressed close to her side, frightened by the chaos. "Mama, why are all these people here?" Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter. "Because we found something special, baby. Something people are excited about. Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble." She looked down at Emma's worried face and felt her resolve harden. "We're going to be just fine." The next morning, Sarah did something she'd been dreading. She walked out the front door of the distillery and faced the cameras. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions over each other. "Ms. Matthews, how does it feel? Did you know what was there? What are you going to do with the money?" The noise was overwhelming, but Sarah stood her ground, her expression calm. She'd prepared a statement with Patricia's help. She pulled the folded paper from her pocket and read it clearly, sent out her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. 3 months ago, I bought this building for $500. It was all I had left. I'd been evicted from my apartment. I'd lost my job, and I was out of options. Everyone told me I was making a mistake, that the building was worthless, that I was throwing away money I couldn't afford to lose. She paused, looking up at the crowd. Some of the townspeople had gathered behind the reporters, watching. She saw familiar faces, people who'd laughed at her, who'd shaken their heads in pity. "I bought it anyway," Sarah continued, "not because I knew what was inside, but because I refused to give up. I worked every day to make this building livable. I cleaned and repaired and salvaged what I could. And yes, I found something extraordinary, on something that's going to change my daughter's life and mine." The reporter started shouting again, but Sarah raised her hand. "I didn't steal this. I didn't inherit it from family. I bought a property that no one else wanted, and I found something that had been lost for 90 years. It's legally mine, and I'm going forward with the auction." She folded the paper, her eyes scanning the crowd. "That's all I have to say." She turned and walked back inside, ignoring the eruption of questions behind her. Her hands were shaking, her heart pounding. But she'd done it. She'd faced them. As the days passed and the media frenzy continued, the town's reaction became more complicated. Some people were genuinely happy for her, stopping by with congratulations and small gifts for Emma. Others were bitter, muttering about luck and unfairness, and about how she didn't deserve it. And then there were those who wanted something from her. A distant cousin she'd never heard of showed up claiming family connection and asking for help with medical bills. A man who said he'd worked at the distillery 40 years ago demanded a share of the find. Someone even tried to sue, claiming the county had no right to sell the property, and therefore Sarah's ownership was invalid. Patricia handled the legal challenges swiftly. Every claim was baseless, every lawsuit dismissed. But the constant barrage wore on Sarah, exhausting her in ways the physical work never had. The worst came from people she'd known, people who'd watched her struggle without offering help. The contractor who'd called her a fool for buying the distillery now claimed he'd encouraged her to take the risk. The landlord who'd evicted her told reporters he'd always believed in her potential. The woman at the grocery store who'd mocked her wrote a letter asking for a loan to save her own business. Sarah read each message, each request, each revision of history, and felt something hardening inside her. These people had watched her suffer, had laughed at her desperation, and now they wanted to share in her fortune as if they'd earned it. She gave them nothing. But there were others, people who genuinely deserved help, who'd shown her kindness when she had nothing. The neighbor who'd watched Emma for free when Sarah couldn't afford a sitter. The librarian who'd let her use the computer long past closing time. The teacher who'd quietly paid for Emma's school supplies when Sarah couldn't. To them, Sarah was generous. She paid off the neighbor's mortgage. She donated money to the library for new computers and books. She set up a scholarship fund at Emma's school in her mother's name. The vindication was sweet, but it was also complicated, because Sarah understood something now that she hadn't before. Money changed everything. Not just her circumstances, but the way people saw her, the way they treated her, the way they invented new histories to align themselves with her success. She'd been invisible when she was poor. Now she was visible in ways that felt just as isolating. December brought the transport of the collection to New York. A team arrived from Whitmore and Associates with specialized trucks and security. Sarah watched as they carefully packed each bottle, each bundle, each document into climate-controlled containers. The cellar where she'd made the discovery was emptied, its secrets finally released into the world. Emma stood beside her, holding her hand. "It looks empty now," she said softly. Sarah nodded. "It does. But that's okay. We got what we needed from it." The auction was scheduled for March 15th. Catherine called regularly with updates. Interest was extraordinary. Collectors from around the world were registering to bid. The marketing campaign featured photographs of the bottles, the distillery, and yes, Sarah herself. The story of the single mother who'd gambled her last $500 had captured imaginations everywhere. People magazine ran a cover story. Good Morning America requested an interview. Netflix reached out about a documentary. Sarah agreed to some requests and declined others, trying to maintain some boundary between her private life and the public spectacle her discovery had become. But she made sure Emma was shielded. No photographs of her daughter, no interviews that involved her. This was Sarah's story to tell, and she would protect Emma from the glare of attention as fiercely as she'd protected her from poverty. In January, Sarah did something she'd been planning since the authentication came back. She drove to the diner where she'd worked before it closed. The building had been empty for months, a for sale sign fading in the window. She bought it. Then she bought the apartment building where she'd been evicted, and the lot next to the distillery where she planned to build something new. With each purchase, she felt herself reclaiming pieces of her past, and transforming places of pain into something different. The diner would reopen, but this time she'd be the owner, not the waitress. The apartment building would be renovated and offered at below-market rates to families who needed help. The lot would become a community center, a place where people could learn trades, find resources, build better lives. Sarah wasn't interested in yachts or mansions or the trappings of wealth she saw flaunted in magazines. She was interested in security, in making sure Emma never felt the fear she'd felt, in giving back to a community that had both failed her and supported her. But she also bought a house, a real house, with 3 bedrooms and a yard and heat that worked. The day they moved in, Emma ran through every room, laughing, her joy so pure it made Sarah's chest ache. "We live here?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. "This is ours?" "Yes, baby, this is ours." That night, Sarah stood in Emma's new bedroom, watching her daughter sleep in a real bed with clean sheets and warm blankets. The stuffed bear was tucked under her arm, its worn fur a reminder of all the nights they'd spent cold and afraid. Sarah had climbed out of that darkness. She'd refused to let it consume her. And now, standing in this room that smelled of fresh paint and possibility, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The auction took place on a cold, bright March day. Sarah flew to New York with Patricia and Emma, staying in a hotel that overlooked Central Park. Emma was enchanted by the city, by the lights and the noise and the endless stream of people. Sarah tried to share her wonder, but her nerves were too frayed. Everything came down to this. The months of waiting, the authentication, the publicity, all of it culminated in a single evening when the collection would be sold and her fortune would be realized. Catherine met them at the auction house, a gleaming building in Midtown. She showed them the catalog, a thick book with glossy photographs of each bottle, each bill, each document. The estimates were printed in small type beneath each item, numbers that still made Sarah dizzy. "You don't have to attend the auction itself," Catherine said gently. "A lot of sellers prefer to wait elsewhere. It can be nerve-wracking to watch." But Sarah shook her head. "I want to be there. I need to see it." The auction room was elegant, all dark wood and soft lighting. Chairs were arranged in rows facing a podium where the auctioneer would stand. Sarah sat in the back with Patricia and Emma, trying to calm her racing heart. The room filled slowly. She recognized some faces from the news coverage, collectors and dealers who'd been interviewed about the significance of the find. Others were strangers, wealthy men and women who'd flown in from around the world to bid on pieces of history. At exactly 7 o'clock, the auctioneer took his position. He was a distinguished man with silver hair and a voice that carried authority. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what promises to be a historic event. The Riverside Collection, the most significant discovery of pre-Prohibition American spirits in history." The first bottle came up, a 1929 bourbon, its label pristine, its seal intact. The auctioneer started the bidding at $20,000. Within seconds, it had climbed to 60, then 80. The bids came fast, the paddles rising across the room, numbers escalating with a speed that left Sarah breathless. "Sold for $135,000, the auctioneer announced, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. Sarah gripped the armrest of her chair. One bottle, $135,000. The auction continued, bottle after bottle, each one selling for staggering amounts. Some went for less than estimated, others for far more. Sarah stopped trying to calculate the total, her mind unable to keep up with the pace. An hour in, they reached one of the centerpiece items, a complete case of 1931 rye whiskey, 12 bottles that had remained together for 92 years. The bidding was fierce, 2 collectors battling back and forth, each refusing to yield. The price climbed past $500,000, then past $1 million. When the gavel finally fell, the case sold for $2.3 million. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and wiped them away quickly, not wanting Emma to see her cry. By the time the last bottle sold, it was nearly midnight. The currency collection came next, bundles of bills displayed in glass cases. The bidding was just as intense, collectors fighting over rare denominations, over bills that had survived when others had been destroyed. When the final gavel fell and the auctioneer announced the close of the auction, the room rose in a standing ovation. Sarah stood with them, her legs shaking, her vision blurred with tears. Catherine appeared at her side, her face glowing with triumph. $74.6 million, she said quietly. You just set a record, Sarah. This is the highest-grossing single-owner spirits auction in history. Sarah couldn't speak. The number was too large, too impossible. Even after the auction house took their percentage, after taxes, after fees, she would walk away with more than $40 million. $40 million. For buying a flooded building no one else wanted. The media coverage the next day was overwhelming. Every major news outlet ran the story. Social media exploded with reactions, some celebrating Sarah's success, others bitter and resentful. The debate raged about luck versus perseverance, about whether she deserved her fortune or had simply stumbled into it. Sarah read some of the comments and then stopped. Didn't matter what strangers thought. She knew the truth. She'd been desperate, yes. Lucky, perhaps. But she'd also been stubborn enough to refuse defeat when every rational person would have given up. Back home in Riverside, the town's attitude had shifted again. Now that the auction was over, now that the amount was public, the envy was harder to hide. Some people stopped speaking to her altogether. Others became obsequious, their false friendliness more insulting than their earlier contempt. But Sarah no longer needed their approval. She'd found something more valuable than their acceptance. She'd found proof that her choices mattered, that her instincts had been right, that she was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had believed. The money arrived in her account on a Wednesday in April. Sarah sat at her computer, staring at the number on the screen, and felt a strange detachment. It was real. It was hers. And it terrified her. She thought of Victor Ashford again, of the man who'd hidden this fortune and died before he could claim it. She wondered if he'd been afraid, too, if the weight of his wealth had felt as heavy as it felt to her now. But she also thought of Emma, sleeping peacefully in her room down the hall, of the scholarship fund that would help other children like her, of the diner that would reopen and employ people who needed work, of the community center that would give people hope. Victor's money had sat in the darkness for 90 years, helping no one. Sarah's money would be different. It would move, change, grow. It would make a difference. Over the following months, Sarah put her plans into action. The diner reopened with better wages and benefits than any restaurant in the county. The apartment building was renovated and renamed Evelyn House, after Sarah's mother, offering affordable housing to families in need. The community center broke ground in June, its design incorporating parts of the old distillery, honoring the history while building something new. Sarah hired people from town, people who'd struggled as she had. She paid them well, treated them with respect, gave them opportunities they'd never had before. Some of the same people who'd mocked her now worked for her, and she saw the shame in their eyes when they realized she remembered every cruel word. But she didn't punish them. She simply gave them a chance to be better. Emma thrived. She had tutors, art classes, music lessons, all the things Sarah had never been able to afford. But more importantly, she had stability, a home that wouldn't be taken away, a mother who no longer stayed awake at night calculating pennies, a future that stretched wide and bright before her. One evening in late summer, Sarah stood on the steps of the old distillery. The building had been stabilized, its roof repaired, its walls reinforced. Part of it would become a museum, telling the story of Victor Ashford and the hidden fortune. Part would house the community center's offices, but the cellar, the place where it had all begun, would remain empty, a memorial to secrets and second chances, to the desperation that had driven both Victor and Sarah into its depths. She thought of that first day, standing in the doorway with Emma's hand in hers, staring at the black water and making a choice that had seemed insane. She thought of the $500, the last of her mother's legacy, gambled on a dream that everyone said was worthless. And she thought of the glint in the darkness, the faint shimmer that had caught her eye and changed everything. Sarah had learned something in these months, something that settled deep in her bones and would stay with her forever. Fortune didn't care about fairness. It didn't reward the deserving or punish the cruel with any consistency. It simply existed, waiting in the dark for someone stubborn or desperate or brave enough to reach for it. She'd reached, and against all odds, she'd found it. A year after the auction, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs. She almost declined, uncomfortable with public speaking, with being held up as an example. But Patricia convinced her to accept. The audience was full of women like she'd been, struggling, desperate, by fighting against systems designed to keep them down. Sarah looked out at their faces and saw herself reflected back. She told them the truth, not a fairy tale about luck or destiny, but the real story. The eviction notice, the mockery, the fear that had kept her awake at night, the moment she'd stood in a flooded cellar and wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. "I didn't succeed because I was special," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I succeeded because I refused to accept that my circumstances were permanent. Because I took a risk when every logical person told me not to. Because I worked until my hands bled and my back gave out, and I had nothing left except the refusal to quit." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Some of you are standing where I stood a year ago, broke, scared, out of options, and you're going to have to make a choice. You can accept what everyone tells you deserve, which is nothing, or you can bet on yourself, on your instincts, on the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's something waiting in the darkness that no one else has seen." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "I can't promise you'll find a fortune in a cellar," Sarah continued, "but I can promise that if you give up now, you'll never know what might have been possible, and that not knowing will haunt you forever." When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Women stood, some wiping tears, others nodding as though she'd spoken directly to their souls. Sarah stood before them, no longer the desperate woman who'd bought a ruin, but something else. A symbol. A reminder that transformation was possible, and even when everything suggested it wasn't. That night, lying in her comfortable bed in her warm house, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, from eviction to mansion, from mockery to respect, from $500 to $40 million. The numbers were staggering, but what mattered more was what they represented. Not wealth for wealth's sake, but freedom. The freedom to choose, to help, to build, to give Emma a life unburdened by the fear that had defined Sarah's. She thought of Victor Ashford one last time, of the man who'd hidden his fortune so carefully and never lived to see it claimed. She hoped, wherever he was, he knew that his secret had finally served its purpose, that it had saved someone, given them a second chance, proven that sometimes the most desperate gambles paid off. And she hoped he would forgive her for doing what he couldn't, for surviving, for claiming the prize, for stepping out of the darkness into the light. Sarah closed her eyes, Emma sleeping peacefully down the hall, and let herself feel what she'd earned. Not just the money, though that was real. But something deeper. Something that no amount of wealth could purchase, but that had come to her anyway, delivered in the form of a flooded cellar and a choice made in desperation. She felt whole. The woman who'd bought a ruin for $500 no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd proven that belief in the impossible, coupled with the refusal to surrender, could move mountains, or in her case, could drain a cellar and find a fortune. Sarah Matthews had gambled everything on a dream no one else believed in, and she'd won. Not because she deserved it more than anyone else, not because fate had chosen her, but because when the moment came, when the choice presented itself, she'd had the courage to say yes. The distillery stood in the darkness outside her window, its walls holding the memory of desperation and discovery. And Sarah, safe and warm and finally free, whispered into the night a single word: "Thank you." The week before the diner reopening, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m, unable to sleep. The commercial appliances gleamed under the fluorescent lights, all stainless steel and promise. She ran her hand along the counter, where she'd once scrubbed dishes for minimum wage, where her boss had yelled at her for being too slow, where she'd cried in the walk-in freezer during her breaks because the cold helped numb everything else. Now she owned it all. Every plate, every stove, every tile on the floor. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd bought the building where she'd been most humiliated, where she'd felt most powerless, and she was transforming it into something that would give others what had been denied to her: dignity, fair wages, a chance. The head chef she'd hired, a woman named Rosa, who'd worked in restaurant kitchens for 30 years without ever getting promoted beyond line cook, found her there in the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Rosa asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot that was always brewing. Sarah shook her head. "Just thinking." Rosa settled onto a stool, her weathered hands wrapped around the mug. "You know, when you offered me this job, I thought it was a joke. Head chef, me, after all these years of men half my age telling me what to do." "You're the best cook I've ever seen," Sarah said. "You deserved it 20 years ago." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "My daughter works at the university now. Full-ride scholarship from that fund you set up." She paused, her voice thick. "She's going to be a doctor, Sarah." "A doctor." "Because of you." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Because of your hard work." "I just opened a door." "No," Rosa said firmly. "You kick down a door that people like us never get to walk through. Don't minimize that." They sat in comfortable silence, two women who understood what it meant to fight for every scrap of respect, every dollar, every moment of peace. The diner would open in 3 days, and Sarah knew it would be packed, not just because of her story, but because Rosa's food was extraordinary, and the prices were fair, and the wages they paid would ripple through the community in ways that couldn't yet be measured. The morning of the reopening, Sarah woke to find Emma already dressed, bouncing with excitement. "Can I help serve today, Mama?" "Please." Sarah smiled, kneeling to straighten her daughter's collar. "You can help greet people at the door. How's that?" Emma threw her arms around her mother's neck. "I'm so proud of you." The words, spoken with such pure sincerity, nearly broke Sarah. She held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the steady beat of her heart. "I'm proud of you too, baby." The line stretched around the block before they even unlocked the doors. Sarah stood inside, watching through the window as people gathered. Some faces were familiar, townspeople who'd known her when she was struggling. Others were strangers, drawn by the media coverage, curious to see the woman who'd found a fortune in a cellar. When she finally opened the door, the first person to step inside was Mrs. Chen, the librarian who'd let her stay late all those nights. The elderly woman's eyes were bright with tears. "I knew you'd do something special," she said. pressing a worn library card into Sarah's hand. "This was your first card. I kept it. Thought you might want it back." Sarah looked down at the card, at her name written in her own younger handwriting, and felt the weight of time collapse. She'd been so different then, so desperate and afraid. The girl who'd signed that card couldn't have imagined this moment. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, "for everything." The diner filled quickly, every booth packed, saw every stool at the counter occupied. Sarah moved through the space, greeting people, her heart full and aching. She watched Rosa commanding the kitchen with quiet authority, watched the servers she'd hired, all single parents like herself, working with the kind of focus that came from finally having a job that paid enough to matter. But it was the moment when her former boss walked in that stopped her cold. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. He'd aged badly, his face lined with stress, his shoulders curved inward. Sarah remembered him as larger, more intimidating. Now he just looked tired and small. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough. "Can we talk?" She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to leave, to remind him of every cruel word he'd ever spoken to her, every time he'd docked her pay for imagined infractions, every moment he'd made her feel worthless. But she also remembered who she'd been when she worked for him. Desperate, grateful for any job, even one that barely paid enough to eat. She'd survived him, and she'd become someone he could never touch again. She led him to a corner booth, away from the crowd. They sat across from each other, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "I heard about what happened," Marcus said finally. "The distillery, the auction." He looked down at his hands. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Sarah waited, saying nothing. "I was hard on you, harder than I needed to be. You were a good worker, and I treated you like you were disposable." He met her eyes. "I was wrong." The apology hung between them, inadequate and late, but genuine. Sarah felt the anger she'd carried loosening, not disappearing, but losing its sharp edges. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly, "my daughter just started working her first job. Minimum wage, terrible boss, same story. And I realized I was that boss to someone else's daughter. To you," he swallowed hard. "I can't take it back. But I wanted you to know I see it now." Sarah leaned back, studying him. The power dynamic had reversed so completely, it was almost dizzying. He sat before her, humbled and apologetic, while she held all the cards. She could destroy him with a word, could share stories that would ensure he never worked in this town again, could exact revenge for every humiliation he'd inflicted. Instead, she said, "Your daughter deserves better than what I had. Make sure she gets it." Marcus nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will. I promise." He left without ordering, and Sarah watched him go, feeling something shift inside her. The anger was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She'd given him something he didn't deserve and probably wouldn't fully appreciate. But she'd done it anyway, because holding on to rage was exhausting, and she had better things to do with her energy. Emma's first day at her new school came in September. Sarah had enrolled her in a private academy an hour away, a place with small classes and teachers who actually cared, with art studios and science labs and a library that made Emma gasp when she first saw it. But on that first morning, Emma clung to Sarah's hand in the parking lot, her usual confidence shaken. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered. "What if they think I'm weird because we used to be poor?" Sarah knelt, taking both of Emma's hands in hers. "Listen to me, baby. You are smart and kind and brave. Anyone who doesn't see that isn't worth your time. And yes, we used to struggle. We used to be scared and hungry and cold. But that doesn't make you less than anyone here. It makes you stronger." Emma's lip trembled. I miss our old apartment sometimes. Is that weird? Sarah pulled her close, understanding more than Emma could know. It's not weird. That place was ours. We survived there together. It's okay to miss it, even if where we are now is better. They sat together in the car for a few more minutes, mother and daughter, holding on to each other before the world demanded they let go. When Emma finally climbed out and walked toward the school building, Sarah watched her go with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. That evening, Emma came home full of stories. A friend she'd made, a teacher who let them pick their own reading books, an art class where she'd painted something she was excited to show her mother. Sarah listened, her heart full, knowing that this freedom to just be a child without fear, shadowing every moment, was worth more than all the money in her account. The community center opened in October. Sarah had worked with architects and designers to preserve the bones of the old distillery while transforming it into something vibrant and alive. The main floor held classrooms for job training, computer labs, a legal aid office staffed by volunteer lawyers. The second floor was dedicated to childcare, bright rooms filled with toys and books, staffed by early childhood educators paid twice the market rate. And in the cellar, the place where everything had changed, Sarah had created something unexpected. A quiet room, dim and contemplative, with the walls left exposed to show the water stains, the cracks, the evidence of what had been. In the center stood a simple placard telling Victor Ashford's story and Sarah's, two lives separated by 90 years, but connected by desperation and hidden treasure. On opening day, hundreds of people came. Some were curious about the space. Others needed the services it offered. Sarah walked among them, shaking hands, answering questions, feeling the weight of responsibility and purpose settling onto her shoulders. An older woman approached her, clutching a worn purse. Her name was Janet, and she'd been laid off from the factory where she'd worked for 23 years. "I don't know how to use computers," she said, her voice shaking with shame. "I don't know how to write a resume or search for jobs online. I'm 58 years old, and I feel like the world left me behind." Sarah took her hand gently. "That's exactly why we built this place." "Come with me." She led Janet to the computer lab, introduced her to Marcus, no relation to her former boss, a patient instructor who specialized in teaching digital literacy to older workers. She watched as Marcus sat with Janet, showing her the basics, his voice kind and encouraging. "This is free?" Janet asked, disbelief in her voice. "Completely free," Sarah confirmed. "And when you're ready, we have career counselors who can help you find work. No judgment, no shame, just support." Janet's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah thought of the nights she'd lain awake calculating pennies, of the eviction notice, of the moment she'd decided to spend her last $500 on a dream everyone called worthless. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said. "And since they didn't, I'm doing it for you." As the weeks passed, Sarah began to understand that wealth didn't solve everything. It created new problems, new pressures, new expectations. People she'd never met felt entitled to her money, her time, her story. The requests never stopped. Charities, individuals, organizations, all asking for help, all with worthy causes, all impossible to fully satisfy. She hired a team to manage the requests, to evaluate the legitimacy, to ensure her money went where it would do the most good. But the guilt lingered. For every person she helped, there were 10 she had to turn away. For every scholarship funded, there were students who didn't make the cut. The weight of choosing who deserved help and who didn't exhausted her. One night, overwhelmed and crying in her beautiful kitchen, Sarah called Patricia. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice breaking. "There's so much need, And no matter how much I give, it's never enough. How do I choose? How do I live with the people I can't help?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You're one person, Sarah. Not a government. Not a foundation with unlimited resources. You're doing more than most people with your wealth ever dream of doing. But you can't save everyone." "Then what's the point?" Sarah asked. "What good is all this money if I still have to watch people suffer?" "The point," Patricia said gently, "is that you're trying. You're using your fortune to create systems that help people help themselves. The diner, the community center, the housing, the scholarships. Those things ripple outward in ways you can't measure. They change lives you'll never meet." Sarah wiped her eyes, knowing Patricia was right, but feeling the burden anyway. Wealth had given her power, but it had also given her the terrible responsibility of wielding that power wisely. In November, Sarah received a letter that changed everything. It was from a historian at the State University, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who'd been researching Victor Ashford's life. The letter explained that Dr. Morrison had uncovered documents suggesting Victor hadn't acted alone. He'd had a partner, a woman named Catherine Wright, who'd run the business side of the distillery, while Victor handled production. Together, they'd built the fortune that Sarah had found. But Catherine's name had been erased from the records. As a woman in the 1930s, she'd had no legal claim to the business, no official ownership, no recognition. When Victor died, she'd vanished from history entirely. Dr. Morrison had tracked down Catherine's descendants, a great-granddaughter living in Oregon, a retired teacher who'd never known her ancestor, had been part of something significant. Sarah arranged to meet her. They sat in a coffee shop in Portland, two women connected by a secret that had waited 90 years to be told. Her name was Helen, and she looked at the documents Dr. Morrison had compiled with wonder. "My great-grandmother did this. She built a distillery." Sarah showed her photographs of the collection, of the auction, of the fortune that had been hidden and found. She explained everything, the whole story. And then she said something she'd been thinking about since receiving the letter. "Half of what I found belonged to Catherine. Legally, it all came to me. But morally, I think you deserve to share in it." Helen looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" Sarah slid an envelope across the table. "I'm giving you $5 million. It's not half, but it's what feels right. Your great-grandmother built that fortune too. Her work made it possible. You should benefit from it." Helen opened the envelope with shaking hands, staring at the check inside, her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it well," Sarah said. "Say you'll remember Catherine. Say you'll make sure her story is told." Helen reached across the table, gripping Sarah's hand. "I will. I promise." That night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah felt something settle inside her. She'd given away $5 million, a sum that would have changed her life a year ago, and she felt lighter for it. The money had never been entirely hers. It had been waiting for the right people to find it, to claim it, to use it. She was just the one who'd been desperate enough to look. The museum section of the community center opened in December. It told Victor and Catherine's story, displayed replicas of some of the bottles, showed photographs of the auction. But it also told Sarah's story, her journey from eviction to fortune, her refusal to give up when everyone said she should. Emma stood beside her at the opening, reading the placard that described her mother's struggle. When she finished, she looked up at Sarah with ancient eyes. "Were you really that scared, Mama?" Sarah knelt, eyes eye level with her daughter. "Every single day, baby. I was terrified, but I didn't let the fear win." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Sarah pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart. "You're already better than me. You get to grow up without that fear. That's all I ever wanted for you." They stood together in the museum, surrounded by the evidence of what desperation and determination could build, and Sarah felt the weight of the journey settle into something like peace. She'd been given a gift, not just the fortune, but the chance to transform pain into purpose, struggle into strength, fear into fearlessness. The woman she'd been, the one who'd stood in a flooded cellar with $500 and a prayer, had died the day the auction ended. In her place was someone new, someone forged by hardship and refined by fortune. Sarah Matthews, benefactor. Sarah Matthews, employer. Sarah Matthews, the woman who'd bet everything on impossible and won. But more than any of that, she was Emma's mother, and that, she knew, would always be her greatest achievement. Winter came, bringing snow that covered the town in white. Sarah stood at the window of her house, watching Emma build a snowman in the yard, and thought about gratitude. She was grateful for the distillery, for the flood that had preserved what others would have destroyed, for the desperation that had driven her to take a risk no sane person would have taken. She was grateful for the mockery because it had hardened her resolve, for the eviction because it had eliminated her last safety net and forced her to leap, and for the years of struggle because they'd taught her what mattered and what didn't. And she was grateful for Victor and Catherine, two people she'd never met, who'd hidden a fortune in darkness and trusted that someday someone would find it, that someone had been her, and she'd made sure their legacy became something more than money-gathering dust. She'd made it matter. Emma called from the yard, beckoning her mother to come play. Sarah pulled on her coat and stepped into the cold, leaving behind the warmth and comfort of the house she owned, the security she'd built, the life she'd earned. She joined her daughter in the snow, laughing and building and living in a moment that would have been impossible a year ago. And in that moment, Sarah Matthews was not a millionaire or a benefactor or a woman who'd found a fortune. She was simply a mother, playing in the snow with her daughter, free from fear and full of hope. It was everything she'd ever wanted. And it was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.